So it's me, and I wanted to do an explanation about MIDI and the Roland SP-404 MK2, got a Polyend Play, and I've got the Arturia MiniLab3. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this was, as I was doing beats on the Roland, what was happening was, and then trying to match it up with the keyboard and actually play consistent notes, was I wasn't being consistent about it. So I figured, well, I could use the Polyend as a sequencer and play the synthesizer pieces of it and synchronize it with the Roland to do the drums and the actual lay down that part of it, and which got me thinking about using MIDI. And then the problem showed up of Roland's MIDI, not implementation, but just the nuances of getting something like this set up. There wasn't a lot of obvious information out there. So I did some research, did some testing, and I wanted to share it. So what I found, so what I've got set up in my, well, I'll explain the problem first. And the problem deals with the MIDI interface itself. So for both the Polyend Play and the Roland SP-404, they use what's called a TRS. So MIDI has a standardized jack, which is this 5-pin DIN. It's been around forever. And then the modern version is called TRS. And TRS stands for tip, ring, and sleeve. And on the 5-pin side of it, they're numbered 1, 2 in the lower middle, then 3, then 4, then 5 on this side. Why they're done like that, I don't know. But the problem happens when mapping the tip, ring, and sleeve to those pins that are actually active, which is the 2, 4, and 5, those lower 3. And so for Roland's, they use what's called TRSA, where the tip is pin 5, the ring is pin 4, and the sleeve is pin 2. But for TRS, for other things like the Polyend, it uses the tip is 4, the ring is 5, and the sleeve is 2. I believe the sleeve is actually the ground side of it, with on both of them, pins 1 and 3 on the MIDI, on the 5-pin DIN connector, are not actually connected to anything. So because of this, if you're getting a cable to work with the Roland, it's got to work with TRS-A. I think some chord keyboards use it too, but just knowing that you've got the two different standards for it means you'll have to look at it. When you buy a cable, specifically the Boss cable, which is a brand of Roland, it should have the pin-out mapping on the back, and even though it doesn't say which kind, A or B it is, it'll at least have the diagram of it, where the tip, ring, and sleeve are connected. So you should be able to connect to it. So having said that, actually putting it to use has its own challenge. So in my first demo here, but the way I've got this connected, the Arturia is just connected with its 5-pin DIN, so it just uses the 5-pin DIN MIDI going into the Polyend Play via MIDI. The Polyend Play's MIDI out is going into the Roland via the Roland TRS MIDI cable. And I have a little, I highly recommend getting a label maker, print your own labels for cables so that you'll know, because otherwise there's nothing on the cable itself that tells you how it is mapped. You're either going to have to test it out with a voltmeter or something else, or just be frustrated. Now I've also got the audio from the Polyend Play going into the Roland, so that I get the basically that audio path, and then the audio out from the Roland. The microphone is also right there, plugged into the Roland. So all of it is channeled through the Roland, and then all of it coming out actually into my phone that I'm recording this on. So that's the first demo I'll do. And what I've got, obviously, as you heard, play a key on the keyboard here, and you'll hear the so that, and it's reflected. Well, and then one of the cool things about the way it looks is it'll tell you which note it's actually playing, which is really handy. And when we play the sequencer, what it's doing is actually playing the notes that I've programmed in here already. Let me mute that line because it's not what I want. But you'll notice nothing happened on the Roland. And so if we look at the MIDI configuration of the Polyend Play, zoom in here a little bit really quick. Transport in is set to the MIDI in jack. The clock out, or so the clock in is set to internal. So the clock for MIDI is what controls the sequencing. So in this case, the Polyend Play is controlling all of it. It's using its internal clock, and it will send it out on that clock out, MIDI out jack, transport out on the MIDI out jack, notes in on the MIDI in jack, and notes in channel on Omni. So channels are a thing with MIDI where you can have up to 16 channels, and you hear things about talking about 16 channels of MIDI. That's part of the standard. Everything is supposed to have 16 channels of MIDI. In this case, what it's actually doing is listening on all channels for all MIDI signals. So in the Arturia, you can actually set which MIDI channel you want it to use by shifting this, shifting the keyboard key. But in this case, I'm using channel 1 because it's going into the Polyend Play. But by default, the Polyend does not forward those MIDI in from the Arturia over to the Roland. And if we did, we would actually see some reaction from the Roland when we played some of these keys. But we don't. However, if we go into pattern mode, the Roland, so here's pattern we set up earlier, and I'm going to stop it because what will happen is now I'm queued up in pattern mode, and I've got a pattern here. If I play here, Polyend triggers the pattern. I want to see it. I go into shift right mode, so I can actually do editing of pattern. You see the keys that I've gotten up. There's my sub. So I've got it just in. And so it synchronizes between the two. Polyend driving it. You can definitely tell it because if I change the BPM, it just starts screaming through it. Now the other piece to see is that it's just going faster and faster. So that's a pretty cool trick. And if you stop it, so that's the demo here. And so basically we can control the sequence from the Polyend Play to actually start playing on the Roland. And I said playing it. It should be the same history. Stop that because so now that was controlling this from that and this into here. So let's switch it around a little bit. Let's stop it, get out of pattern mode. I actually want to use the Roland to drive the Polyend. Now for that, it should be, you'd think, oh, I could just swap the two cables around, but remember our input is coming in from the Arturia. So what I want to do with it is now go to demo 2, which is now the Polyend Play. It still has the audio going into it, but the SP-404 is MIDI out, going into the Polyend Play. The MiniLab is now going into the SP-404, and the audio out still coming from the SP-404, going into the Mac, or going into the mic of the cell phone. So please wait. So MIDI in and out on the back of the here. So now we're going to go out from Roland And now into our Polyend Play. And these are actually harder to see. Yep. Now this is my guy. Unfortunately, because it's TRSA, I can't just use the same cable. I've actually got to swap out whole cables to go from the Arturia to Roland. To the SP-404, not to the entire Roland Corporation. Could edit this out, but you know what? Why? All right, so now, in theory, we've got the 404 controlling the Polyend, being controlled by the Arturia. And so now we get into a little bit of interesting discussion about the way Roland does its MIDI implementation. So if you go into the system menu, let's zoom in again. Yoink. There we go. So in the system menu, you'll find the third tab over here. You got General, click in MIDI. So MIDI. MIDI sync is set to MIDI, and you can change it to USB, MIDI, internal, auto. MIDI means the MIDI jack itself. And we want to do the same thing where we say it's internal. So now its clock is controlling things. MIDI sync out is on, so basically it's sending that synchronization signal out, so it's in control. There's a slight delay. Do we want to send out the notes? Yes. Bend, pad note out is on. Soft through is actually important for us, because now what happens with a soft through on, that means that the incoming signal to the Roland is also sent to the out. So now test, 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 test. This is a recording. This is a recording. Jesus Christ. I'm trying to find out what. Oh my God. Oh, so that was because the Arturia has a neat feature where if you drop your phone, everything. Where it has a hold button. If you hit the hold button, it'll keep playing that same key over and over again. So anyway, where were we? Back in the system menu of the SP-404. There we go. So system, explanation. Soft through is on, so basically it makes the SP-404 relay for MIDI, and then importantly, the MIDI mode. So the SP-404 has two modes of MIDI, A and B, and they basically change the way the pads are counted in MIDI. So in MIDI mode A, everything's sent on channel 1, and it starts with C3 or starts with C2 and goes up to E flat 3. And it's interesting that they go up in this direction, across from the bottom, so they don't match the numbers. This is from Roland's reference guide. It is kind of a bit to understand, but this is all in A modes, everything sent on channel 1, and all of the pads, no matter what bank you're on, send these notes. So basically it's, if you want to trigger something external, only using the pads, it'll work. So in this case, send back out, all the way out. where we've got, so I'm on bank C. What's happening is that's bank C3. These are the notes, bank C3, C3, D3. So D sharp 3 is Roland's E flat 3. So if you know, E flat is down a semitone, so a D sharp is up a half a semitone. So that's where E flat 3 and D sharp 3 are the same note, which is why it displays it this way here, but it's a Roland bank, and it doesn't matter which bank you're on. Yep. We're always getting that same note. If you use MIDI set B mode, however, it actually has the full range of, I'm just switching it over to B mode, all notes now. So there's E6, C6, G5, E5, and if I go back a bank, I'm going back down, and notice most of these banks are empty, don't have anything in them. A mostly empty project. But as I go down in bank, I'm actually going lower in notes, and that's the way Roland implemented this. So on banks A to F, it goes from C0, octave 0 C, to E flat 1, and B and G goes from E1 to G1, H, C goes to A to B3, D, C4 to E5, E, F5 to G6. So it basically, in B mode, it emulates more of a keyboard, whereas in A mode, it's one shots. I'd almost say that's probably the intent. A mode is more for if you're going to do one shots or trigger drums, whereas if you're going to control a synthesizer or full range of notes, you're going to do it from B mode to get both of them. And so so now basically we're in a mode where we're triggering the synthesizer and the Polyend Play from Roland. Now let's actually, and we're also triggering the Polyend Play synthesizer, but nothing on the Roland because it's singing through that MIDI 3 mode is letting it trigger over here. Nothing's happening over here. However, if I switch the banks to one where I've got notes on it, and I'm in B mode, so I need to shift back to A mode in this case because I want to show that I'm triggering those. Now I'm back in A mode. Yes. And it is only the A bank, and so you can see. So the Roland is being controlled from the Arturia. So now let's get into actually kicking off the pattern. So as soon as we go into pattern mode and select a pattern, it sends the sequence start message from the Roland SP-404 to the Polyend Play, and it starts playing the pattern. I'm trying to mute one of the lines in the Polyend Play, and unfortunately it's ignoring that, so that it actually includes an extra line that I couldn't, would normally have left out. And if I stop the pattern, the Polyend Play, the triggers are still happening on the SP-404, and so I see those notes being played on the Polyend Play. So what's happened is the sequence message, which says play the pattern, has stopped. However, the notes are still continuing. Those notes are continuing as the Roland, the SP-404, is continuing to play its sequence. That continues on. So if we go into the pattern here, in jump, we can see pads 9, 10, and 11 are what are being triggered in this case TRX mode. And those are the notes that are being played. That's 9, 10, 11. This also leads me to a real frustration of the Polyend Play. As soon as you touch one of the knobs, it switches the display, which is why I went away from the note display. What I haven't touched on is you can control the FX triggers from what are called control codes. So that's another part of the MIDI standard that allows you to control external things. And so you can actually use the pads on the Arturia to trigger pads over here, and so the program and the knobs to actually control different settings on the FX looper. I've not done that because it's a lot more work to figure out which the correct mapping of those things are, and then to actually code them in on each side of it. It is possible, just haven't done it. And I don't know how that would work from here to here. So that is sequencing with MIDI between the SP-404, the Polyend Play, and the Arturia MiniLab.